So let's get right into this very, very rich material, 17th century Italy and Spain. We're going to see really one slice of Baroque culture. And having a map in front of us, I like to look at maps in just a very, very brief way, just to kind of get us oriented geographically. And I want to remind you that we are in Southern Europe for this presentation. We're going to talk about Counter-Reformation Baroque, or to put it another way, the Baroque that came out of the Catholic nations of Europe. And you can see that Catholic Europe, which is sort of it's a fleshy pink with a little bit of gray, that it covers Spain and the central and southern parts of Italy, Naples down to Sicily. And then you have, of course, a Catholic outpost up there in Flanders, one part of what is now the Dutch Republic. And then you can see spread around, it was a period of Habsburg power and Holy Roman power, Holy Roman Empire power in most of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So the Baroque style, the name Baroque is like a couple of other art historical terms. It actually came from a mild insult. Because keep in mind that coming out of the Renaissance, there was an ideal of classicism, and classicism emphasized harmony and symmetry, and Baroque was wildly expressive and irregular. So the name comes from what the Italian jewelers would call Barocco, the saltwater pearl, which looks like a pearl that's maybe related to chewing gum in some way. So I have a photo there to give you a visual. It was very much a style of complexity and drama, and also was a style that often went with a very, very defined program. You know, usually a persuasive religious program was embedded in a Baroque image. I want to mention that in this period, it was a very expansive period economically, and that mercantilism, which is a simple way of saying that countries were nationalistic in their export ideas. They tried to maximize their export funding. That was changing the world economy. And in Rome, where so much rebuilding had happened in the 16th century, expansive building continued. And the grand scale, the ambition, and the ornateness of Baroque architecture really has never been equaled. I think that at the end of the 17th century, I'm going to give you a very rough figure, but I think there were nearly 1,000 churches in Rome when we got to the end of this period. So looking at an early Baroque facade by Maderno, when you look at this, you'll first look at it, I think, and say, well, there are the classical columns. You know, could it be really that much different from what would have been built 100 years or 50 years before? But I want you to look at what the facade is doing. When you look to the lower level and you see that little portico, you can see that half-round columns are jutting out, they're moving forward. And then at the very edge, pilasters, which is a flat column, really a decorative column, are framing the edge. And then up above it, you get more variations with pilasters. You get scroll buttresses, giving you that sexy curve that holds it all to the center for engineering purposes. And that just keeps going up and up to a cross at the top. So with all of the light and shadow being created and all that dynamism of forms coming in and out, you've got now the beginning of the Baroque. You've got a church that is really showing itself off in the facade, and a church that's very, very impressive when you look up toward the light and see all the surfaces. I should mention that the street height of this photo, the street height we now see in Rome, is probably a good 20 feet higher than it was in the Baroque era, because they just keep paving, even much higher than it was in ancient Rome. So you're seeing, you know, what still is above ground of this facade. The dominant figure of the Italian Baroque has to be Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And I thought I'd start out by showing you one of his public monuments, the Great Triton Fountain, created toward the end of his career. But you know, what did he not do? He was an architect, he was a designer, he was mainly known as a sculptor, but he had a kind of a decorative flair that is synonymous with the Baroque. And he was also, when I use the word passionate, we think of passionate as being profoundly emotional. Like Caravaggio, he also was a violent man. He at one point ordered he ordered a servant to take a razor and deface the and ruin the face of his wife, who he accused of cheating. He also personally nearly beat his brother to death in St. Peter's. So when we say passionate and violent and profoundly animated in everything he created and in his life story. So here's a work he did just before he was 20 years old, St. Lawrence. And if you want to think about things that you might attempt to try carving in marble, what about flames? Because St. Lawrence is a martyr who was literally barbecued to death. And the story goes, probably an untrue story, but still worth repeating, is that St. Lawrence, after he was laid on the coals, told his torturers to turn him over because the other side needed to be done. But here is Bernini's early carving, this fantastically expressive, incredible body of a young man being roasted with flames and charcoal and embers, all carved in marble beneath it. And then, maybe even more astonishing, this figure of Prosperina, done when he was 23. You can see why he got the church's attention. The abduction of Prosperina, so a mythological scene, being taken to the underworld by Pluto. And look at the twists and turns and the violence of that pose. And I often see this on Facebook when people talk about Bernini. Look at the way that the hand of Pluto clutches her thigh, and the way that you feel the softness of her flesh. And look at the delicacy of the fingers that reach upward. Astonishing facility in carving. I think you get a feeling of a self-portrait in Bernini's David, and I want to briefly compare it to some other Davids. The legend actually goes, by the way, that the Pope held a mirror so that Bernini could carve his own features for that very, very intense imagery. But going back, take a look at what earlier sculptors had tried to do with David. With the Donatello David, we get this kind of serene young man who's elegant with homoerotic vibes. With Michelangelo's David, we get a young man who is perfect at the height of his development, clear, calm, looking toward the threat of Goliath. And in Bernini, we get this raw anger. We get a corkscrew body that's reaching back, holding a sling and a rock, and who's going to fire off in a moment. And of course, the implied Goliath in the world of Bernini is, well, it's me, it's the Protestants. And this is the Counter-Reformation righteous anger of Bernini displayed in his David. Fantastic. Look at what the lower lip is doing under his teeth. Even with pretty uninteresting subject matter, in this case, a member of the Borghese family who had become a cardinal, Bernini could achieve a kind of lifelike quality where you could feel the sweat on the cheek, or you could feel the lips pursed as the man is about to say something. Look at the softness around these eyes, and with the drill marks that indicate the irises, the way you feel him turning to look at something as he's about to start a conversation. Look at the ear. That's fantastic. I'm going to switch now to architecture. I'm going to say a little bit more about Bernini, but also about some others. You want to think of St. Peter's as a kind of a grand ongoing project over 150 years with contributions from all kinds of architects and designers, including Michelangelo. And this is the way you would approach the plaza, today, the piazza, as a tourist, with the 3,000-year-old Egyptian obelisk looming in the foreground. But I want to tell you that Bernini played a major role in the construction of St. Peter's, including his greatest failure. The two bell towers that you see there that are nearly as high as the dome on the right and left lasted less than a decade and had to be taken down, because even though Bernini was warned that they were too heavy for that site and for the foundation, he went and plunged ahead, and these were constructed, and they were going to potentially damage the rest of the building. They began to crack very, very early on. So that's part of the Baroque story, is the story of projects that were too grand to be sustained. But what Bernini came up with next after those were demolished still stands today and still is a big part of St. Peter's and the experience of St. Peter's. It's its fantastic piazza, which has a colonnade that wraps around a giant oval shape. And there it is for above. It holds easily more people than Dodger Stadium standing, wrapped in the embrace, if you will, of the Catholic Church. It tries to make a very imposing setting, warm in a certain way. And all of the figures, the card figures above it, were executed under Bernini's supervision, looking down on this kind of colossal, conception. And when you go inside, you guessed it, there's more Bernini. And there's a great deal of recycling that's happened in Rome because, Rome is a mine of materials going back to the ancient times. And the bronze for the Baldaquino. And by the way, Baldaquino, the word means canopy or silk tapestry. But the Baldaquino was made from bronze that was taken out of the ceiling of the Roman Pantheon. But here is how you'd see it approaching it today. And, looking up where you see the Holy Spirit and the sunburst, which is very much a Bernini touch. You just see how overwhelming and fantastic and detailed it is. By the way, it's just now undergoing an 800,000 euro restoration. Some of the gilding is being redone. But take a look, if you still have any questions about what is Baroque and what's the spirit of Baroque, look at these two columns. The classical model, there's a Corinthian column from the 3rd century on the right. And the Greeks conceived, the column as this noble, arm-like architectural attribute that was straight and linear with the decoration reserved for the top. Look what Bernini did. He created corkscrews that you follow with your eyes up to the top of the tabernacle, feeling dizzy as you do it. And these are covered with sheaves of wheat and bees and laurel leaves. I mean, it is just a crazy variation on the idea of the column. Something you can do if you get dazzled by today's presentation, if you get dazzled by Rome and you don't have a plane ticket, which most of us don't, I really want to recommend the Vatican's virtual tour of St. Peter's. And it's the first thing that comes up on Google. You'll have no trouble finding it. Just look for, the Holy See or the Vatican tour of St. Peter's. But I'm going to give you just a taste of it to get the feeling for it. It comes up with an overview of the plaza, and you can choose your destinations, including you can see St. Peter's Square at night. But I think I'm just going to go to the altar and take you in. And normally, I'm sure Martha knows this, when you go, as part of a tour at St. Peter's, it's very crowded. Well, it was very empty on this particular day. And we can look up and look towards that cupola. Looking up through the Baldaquino. And then we'll zoom in. And, when you go to St. Peter's, you feel overwhelmed. I felt overwhelmed and maybe a little bit drunk. It seems like an impossible building. But even though I remember being very dazzled when I was there, I want to repeat something that our guide told us. He said that on the outside of the dome, outside this kind of roundel, that there's a stone edge that's large enough that 2 Fiats can drive around it side by side. And I don't think they actually do that, but I want to give you a feeling of the scale of the building. Anyways, that is astonishing. Let me see if I can go back. Show you one little bit more. I just keep going in, I guess. It's probably one of these sites you can never get out of. And instead we just keep getting closer to heaven. All right. Let's go back to Zoom, but just a taste of that. You can go in on your own time and take a better look. The job of Baroque artists and Baroque architects in Italy, it's pretty obvious. It's the glorification of the church. And the cleverness they brought to this. Here's one of Bernini's other conceptions. It's a royal stairway that connects parts of the Vatican, the Scala Regia. And to make this staircase particularly grand, he came up with an idea where light would stream in an arched window, which you see at the very, very back. And then he both narrowed the corridor and, of course, made it taller through stairway at the top. And it exaggerates the depth of the stairway, this kind of perspective effect. So it makes everything feel larger in back than it really is. And I want to give you here's an engraving of what it looked like in the 18th century. So you can get a feeling for the scale of that, even without the light. And if you're wondering what you're seeing, to the right is a statue of the Byzantine founder, Constantine the Great, and then above is the coat of arms of Pope Alexander VII, who commissioned the staircase. But it's just one of the dozens and dozens of wows you get when you visit the Vatican complex. But after the setback of the towers being taken down in front of St. Peter's, Bernini, as fantastic as he was, did have a career that was ebbing. He wasn't getting as many commissions, but wow, did he reestablish himself with this work that he did for the Coronaro Chapel. And with false modesty, he once called it his least bad work. There's a quote for you if you're thinking about criticism. So it's a complete tableau. You enter this kind of theater, and I'll show you the theater seats a little bit later, where you see this fantastic moment and miracle. And the moment is that Saint Teresa of Avila has been visited by an angel who is about to pierce her heart with an arrow. And of course, you can call him an angel, you can call him Cupid. And if you're thinking there's a distinctly erotic vibe to this statue, there absolutely is. I think even her toes are curling as if she's having a spiritual orgasm. And look at what the folds of her clothing do. And the folds, of course, rise above a cloud, another impossible thing like barbecue flames that only Bernini would try to carve. And her face has this expression of being absolutely, between worlds, between the worlds of the senses and the worlds of pleasure. Look at her lips just barely open and her eyes beginning to close. And then there's the angel himself who looks on, with a Baroque decorative kind of glee. He's mischievous, but he's not all bad. Behind him, gilded sun rays that lead to a window that lights the whole scene. And here are the witnesses. It includes some figures from the Bible and also members of the Coronaro family that paid for this. So if they paid for it, they should definitely have front row seats to witness this miracle. And then a detail I really love on the floor, gesticulating skeletons looking up from hell, wishing they could be there and reminding us all of mortality. So talk about theater. There was nothing like this in our culture until we had surround sound and Dolby and, late 20th century theaters. But this fantastic, unbelievable, engaging series of events that inspired people to greater faith. And that's the message of the statue, faith and miraculousness. There is not a big emphasis on the rational in Baroque. Since I mentioned that so many churches went up during this century, let's look at a few more churches. And there were often complaints from some of the more conservative clerics that the facades of churches were being deformed. And I think Borromini probably would have taken that as a compliment because that's what he meant to do. And look at the curved in and out facade of this chapel, St. Carlo at the Four Fountains. And I'll show you the Four Fountains in a moment. But look at the way the building doesn't have an edge. Normally, there'd be a basilica format with an edge or a corner. Well, the corner is gone. Instead, there's a receding fountain. There are sculptures wherever you can put them on the lower level. There is a kind of a oval shape, a medallion that is held by angels looking like it might fall off the facade if it tilted a little bit more. But that's the spirit of Baroque. Everything moves and pulses. And I found this on Wikipedia. There's a church on every corner at this particular intersection. And I found a panoramic shot that has 3 of them. And that's the feeling of Rome, a 17th century church on every corner. Here's the plan. So you can see that he's gone away from the traditional round dome like you would have seen at St. Peter's. I came up with an oval plan, which was something new, and it meant that the surrounding chapels were also irregular in the way they supported it. And this is what you see when you look up into the dome of San Carlo. You see these, elegant, bracelet-like shapes around the oval dome. You see coffers that have been forced into different configurations. And there's this kind of wonderful asymmetry, as if the opening is maybe a dome that was opening and closing, giving you special access to heaven. But here's another variation on the idea of facade. Look at what he did at St. Ivo. And this one has its own pair of arms. It has a double colonnade. But as you come toward the entrance, you notice the entrance curves towards you. And that hasn't been done before. But as the entrance curves towards you, it feels like the space above it curves and curves away from you. And to get to the very, very top, you have what one of my students called a soft serve ice cream cone in Baroque. And that paper got an A, by the way. And then a tremendous orb and a cross, the symbol of the Catholic Church above it. What a concoction. And here's the plan of that church, where you get this kind of six-figured, irregular dome. And when you step inside, something remarkable has happened, which is the architecture has all been painted white. And you normally would expect more color or frescoes or gilding, but the white color emphasizes the architecture. So we have form being emphasized rather than the decoration itself. But you get that one burst of color with the gilded sunburst up ahead, and it's lit by the light of the cupola. Fantastic. And people came, Rome always was a great tourist city. People came from all over the world. I read a letter about someone that came from India to see this dome, and then took the ideas back to India. Influential all over the world. But there's variety in Baroque. So let's go a different direction for a moment. Let's look at some of the painting. Caravaggio invented a style of painting that I think you're really going to see French painters of the 18th century borrow and extend. It's the idea of the pastoral landscape. And in this case, it's the flight into Egypt of Joseph and Mary. And you can see them coming across a riverbank with Mary holding the infant Christ. Behind them, a shepherd and his sheep, which is very, very much a Christian image. But look at the center. The center is a Roman building. It's a Roman ruin. So it's a historical painting, but it's also a visually restful painting that takes you back in time. And that is the invention of a new kind of landscape where you can savor the beauty and the pleasures of the past. And in this case, you also can have the feeling that you're looking at a pious religious painting. You kind of get a little bit of both worlds. Ceiling painting became an important part of Baroque Italian art, and I'm going to talk more about that theme in a moment. But I thought first I'd show you the work of Caravaggio in the Farnese Palace. Remember that Michelangelo had set the standard for what a ceiling painting should be. It was a very, very high mark to try and compete with, but Caravaggio, was not bad. He took a bit of subject matter that I think Venetians would have appreciated, the triumph of Bacchus and all of that, flying angel energy and running figures, goats, and even tigers, although I think Caravaggio had never seen a tiger because they have kitty cat heads, if you take a look. But look at that bold color, that sense of weightlessness, all of the bodies inspired by Michelangelo. And there's a lot of reasons in the Farnese Palace to look upwards and not notice what's happening on the ground, even when it's just mythology and not heaven that you are looking at. So isn't it a shock to go back briefly to last month's subject, to go back to Caravaggio, at one moment, brilliant Venetian-like colors, Michelangelo-esque figures, fantasy, drama, theater. And then you get to something so different and so stark in Caravaggio. And I think that context will help you again, if you weren't here last month, but understand how by being observational, by looking at real models and real figures and deepening his lighting, Caravaggio took one part of Baroque Italian art such a very, very different direction. Again, he is grounded. He's grounded in the real, and he wants to make you think you can participate in his paintings. And it's so different in what happens in most Baroque Roman painting, where you feel like there's a kind of a fantasy that you're not a part of. You're an awestruck spectator. But whereas in Caravaggio, you feel like a participant. I also want to mention, where this kind of leg of Baroque painting went. I mentioned in last month's lecture, there were many, many followers of Caravaggio. I have a favorite. My favorite is Orazio Gentileschi. And if you're in Southern California or you visit Southern California, this painting's at the Getty. It's newly restored and it's a killer painting. That wasn't a very academic term, but just a dazzling, dazzling painting. Lot and his daughters, and you see drunken Lot, leaning on his daughter's thigh as she points across a rock. But that lighting is so crisp, and the textures are so beautifully realized. It's observational painting, a la Caravaggio. But wait, there's more. It was his daughter, Artemisia, who he trained, and that's really the only way that women artists really had a shot in the 17th century was an uncle or a father, or maybe a lover would train them to paint. And Artemisia Gentileschi, who you probably know if you've heard of her, was involved in a long involved rape trial, had good reasons to feel a sense of vengeance against men. And she was a Caravaggisti in the sense that she engaged in the kind of violence he engaged in his paintings. Here, Judith slaying Holofernes. And what an astonishing painter she was. But back to the ceilings. Now we'll go back to heaven after that violence. I found a very nice quote on the internet, so I want to, credit the art historian who wrote this for Smart History. And I'll, be like a high school teacher and read it to you for a moment. The Baroque period produced many new and innovative pictorial modes of expression, and none more so than the painted ceiling. Let that sink in because it's so true. But patrons and artists began turning their eyes upward and came up with inventive ways of decorating ceilings with a variety of motifs, from the classical gods and goddesses to the apotheosis of the saints and the glorification of family lineage. And let's do some vocabulary. Apotheosis is the rising to heaven, rising to sainthood. Here's another fantastic ceiling painting, this one by Guido Reni, who did several versions of Aurora. And of course, Aurora is the sun, the light, the goddess of the light and the morning being, pursued across the morning sky by Apollo in his chariot. And there's a gracefulness in this painting that reminds me of honestly earlier Renaissance painting. And I think you should know that Reni was looking back at classical models, just like Botticelli did, for the graceful kind of dancing figures with their hands held, who are in a different color scheme at the forefront of this otherwise golden painting. But what a thing to look up and see, and to think about the passage of time and the passage of daylight into the world. Baroque created some works of art that were truly extreme. Can I say too much, or is that too obvious to say too much? But take a look at Pietro da Cortona's fantastic mural for the triumph of the Borromini family, and what a budget they must have given him. Because the first thing he did in this ceiling is he extended the idea of the architecture, where you see molding, where you see rectangular molding around the center of this fantastic fresco. That's not actual molding. That's not real architecture. That is the painted illusion of architecture. So trompe l'oeil, eye-fooling painting, eye-fooling architecture is very, very much a part of the Baroque program. And so when your eyes are, taken to the center of this fantastically dramatic painting that includes biblical and mythological scenes. For example, there's Vulcan at his forge down on my lower left, or up above me, upside down, there's a drunken overweight Bacchus. I don't know if you can see him, But let's take you toward the center and show you what the Barbarinis paint for. They got the golden Barberini bees up there along with the apotheosis and also the keys to St. Peter's, the keys to the papacy. And honestly, I don't see how those cupids and floating ladies could hold those keys. I think they would weigh tons and they'd be coming right toward the ground. That's the miracle of Baroque painting. Another nice detail at the lower left, you can see the crown of stars that are going to be worn by the lucky Barberini who ascends to those giant 9-pound bumblebees. When you look at this Baroque facade, that's an early Baroque facade, and some people say it was maybe the first, true Baroque facade at the early 17th century. I think you would look and say, well, that's an inviting church. It's a fairly flat facade with some nice pilasters and some scrolls. But when you get inside, something astonishing happens. The artist Galli, who, by the way, was consulting with Bernini, Bernini gave him advice on doing this, wanted to make a Baroque ceiling fresco that literally broke the bounds of reason and broke the bounds of architecture. So his subject, because it's a Jesuit church, is the triumph of the name of Jesus. And you can barely, I don't think you can make it out. I have a detail where maybe you can begin to see it. But what is rising to the center of this all kind of nuclear cloudburst at the top are the initials, the insignia of Christ himself. And it's creating this burst of energy that seems to blow angels out one end, and the damned on the right are being blown out the other. So it's like kind of a fantastic spiritual clarification. And there's a closer look where if you look toward the center of that, energy burst, you can see a floating cross and what looks like maybe an H and an S. That's the insignia of Christ. And what an innovative painting in the sense that he used this kind of yellow-white light to, supercharge and almost make invisible the figures that crowd around the burst of light that is Christ. And you can see that there are stucco figures. The stucco figures tumble into and out of this painting. So it's both a painting and a three-dimensional ensemble of figures, some of them painted, that all come together to make you believe in something that really is absolutely impossible and unbelievable. But the role of art in Baroque was to make that credible, like a fantastic set of architectural special effects. Here's another, the glorification of St. Ignatius. And this is another example of real and unreal architecture. If you look far to the left, look at the very, very left edge, you see a little bit of real architecture. You see the actual arch of the interior of the church. But everything you see off to the right, almost everything you see, and the other archway on the other side, on the left side, is painted architecture. So we have this trompe l'oeil architecture, and all of the energy and all of the floating figures, some of whom you are looking at their legs and their skirts from underneath, they are all drawn toward the center. They are drawn upward toward heaven and toward faith and toward inspiration. And, I think when I look at this, I think heavenly aerobics. It's like a form of spiritual exercise and spiritual flight as a metaphor. Leaving Italy, which is hard to do, but we have to do it for our lecture today. Let's go to Spain. And I want to give a very, very different context for Spain to explain the different character of the work, even though it is Catholic work. It's always worth mentioning the Islamic influence in Spain, remembering that Spain had been occupied by the Arabs up to the mid-11th century, and there'd been an intermingling of the cultures. You also want to keep in mind that Spain was at war constantly in the early 16th century, and the wars defined the Spanish nation and constrained their artistic ambitions for a while. There's also kind of a Spanish character in the art we're going to see. A lot of Spanish Baroque art has a dark or a gloomy outlook. And we'll use an Italian word to describe a Spanish phenomenon, tenebroso, dark tension. And very definitely Spanish Catholicism and the way it expressed itself had a morbid aspect, an austere and morbid outlook. I am just going to do a personal thing here with this one painting because I love this painting. And I'm going to give you something you won't find in the textbooks. You only get it here at the Winslow Art Center. And I may be way off base, but I really am entranced by the work of Juan Sanchez Cotan, who made the still life you can see in San Diego in Balboa Park at the San Diego Museum of Art. And if you look at it literally, if you look at it for just what the eyes see, you see an observational still life that must have come from a pretty nice vegetable and fruit cart, and you see it staged. There really is a sense of theater about the way these objects are portrayed. You see that two of them, a cabbage and a quince, are hanging from strings at the top. So just visually, it's a theatrical, striking painting. But I try to keep in mind, this is from an era when religion and questioning and spirituality infused everything. So with help of Photoshop, I'm going to clear off that picture and just give you the stage to look at for a moment. You can kind of clear out your mind. And then I've been asking myself, what are the objects? What are they making me think about? And I know that in Venetian painting, I've been told that there were hierarchies of love, different kinds of love. And take a look at the objects that appear in Sanchez Cotan. We have the cabbage, which I'm going to say, like the human mind or even the human soul, is in layers, has leaves that can be peeled away until you get to the heart. It's something that you can look at that way. With the melon, I always think of the fact that Picasso called his later mistress, Marie Therese, he called her his sweet melon. And there's something very, very feminine, even erotic, in the melon with the slice taken out of it. And above it, well, there's something that's rather distinctly male. Mae West style. Is that a cucumber or is that just something in your pocket? I really botched Mae West there. But you put all of this together and you include the fact that the quince was often a marriage fruit. It was something about, the symbolism of the quince being shared by married people in the Middle Ages. In classical times, it was sacred to Venus. So it is a symbol of, erotic love, but also spiritual love. And I'm going to tell you that I think this little Baroque still life is an erotic painting, but it's also a painting about love. And the very, very highest love is the love of God. And this is about a spiritual union with God. Below it, there's things that are more base and more basic, like sexuality and sensuality. And this was made by a man who, by the way, within 2 years had committed himself to a monastery. And maybe it's even a confession of sin, a confession of some of his lustful thoughts. Anyways, that was a lot of me theorizing about a Spanish Baroque painting, but those tensions are there. In this painting of Rivera, the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, he did something that Rubens had done in his paintings, which was he used a kind of a shipbuilding metaphor. He used hoisting. And we can see that St. Bartholomew is about to be hoisted up into a crucifixion, and he will be skinned alive. So you have to look at him and imagine what he's thinking as he looks up to heaven as his only salvation, facing an imminent death. It's a very Spanish subject matter for that painting. Or in Zurbaran's Saint Serapion, we have a saint, if you look at his wrists, he's in a dungeon. So he is being, tied up, he's being tortured. But you don't know when you look at him whether he's alive or dead, and you don't know as he may be sleeping. And there's also a hint of something rather peaceable about his features. So maybe in torment, in isolation, in torture, there is a spiritual knowingness that he has that actually endows this rather morbid painting with a sense of peace. And of course, what a bravura piece of painting that white garment is, hitting at his purity in this very, very dark situation. Observational painting, Tenebroso painting, chiaroscuro painting really reaches its climax in Velasquez. I'm going to say he's to Spain what Bernini was to Italy. And look at this painting, The Water Carrier of Seville. It's just pure visual pleasure. The subject matter is a young man has come into the marketplace and gotten a glass of fresh water from a clay jug. And so it's about that. But look at the visuals. Look at the coil clay jug with the drops of moisture on the outside dripping down the coils. Or look at the pitch pot in front of him. Look at the torn sleeve of the water cellar and the way it creates a space of dark and light. Behind all of it, do you notice there is yet another figure drinking, deep into the background. So we have this kind of tenuous space. Velasquez brought this feeling of observational painting to mythology in a way rather like Caravaggio had done. And I want to answer a question maybe some of you are having. Did Caravaggio influence Velasquez? And the answer is nobody really knows. It is not thought that Velasquez saw any Caravaggio paintings in the flesh. He may have seen engravings, he may have seen prints, and he may have seen the work of some of Caravaggio's followers. So it may be coincidence, or there may be some influence. That's the best answer I can come up with. But look at here at the forge of Vulcan, and look what happens when this man finds out that his wife is cheating on him. Look at the faces being told by an angel, really an interfering angel. Look at the bodies of the men. Look at their surprise. Look at the light of the metal on that anvil. What a tour de force of light in painting. And a very limited palette as well. So, of course, Velasquez's talent got him official commissions. And this one is so interesting because this is actually a Spanish defeat. The Dutch and the Spanish were constantly at war in the first part of this century. And the surrender at Breda was actually the Spanish surrendering to the Dutch commander. But you wouldn't get that feeling from the painting. Because if you look at the Dutch, they look confused. Their uniforms need cleaning. There's a fire behind them. And one man even seems to be kind of, gesticulating and trying to figure out what just happened. But the Spanish, who, by the way, are giving the Dutch a horse's ass, I think that's a very nice touch. The Spanish are gracious. The Spanish general is his black and gold gilded armor, and their spears are still pointing upwards. It's as if the Spanish have it together, and the crazy, chaotic Dutch just happen to win. That's the power of Velasquez. The subject matter he had for royal portraits was not that inspiring. He had King Philip the Fourth, who had a lantern jaw and a waxed mustache and kind of tired eyes with his hair combed back. So to distract you from that, Velasquez had this kind of dot and dash style of impasto painting. If you could see this up close, it's like a Rembrandt, heavily textured painting with glazing, where all of your attention sooner or later goes to the sleeve and the embroidery, and it takes you away from the face and the tiredness of the king. So distraction was another talent of the artist. And Velasquez achieved so much in his career. He had so much status that he, toward the end of his career, began to paint what he felt like painting. I really doubt this was a royal commission or anything that anyone would pay for, but it's Velasquez's own meditation on what it means to be a painter in the Baroque era. It's the Maids of Honor, and the subject matter is that the Infanta Margarita has come to the studio to be painted. So the little girl there in the skirt, in the panier skirt, is the actual subject of this composition. She's in the center. But looking around her, the painting gets a little more confusing the longer you look at it. And the question I used to ask my students is, what's the real subject of the painting and who's in charge? And I think the answer has to be Velasquez, because there he is looking at you from behind his own canvas. He's in charge of history because he's painting the painting. He's creating the work that's now in the Prado that gives us our view of Spain in the time of his lifetime. And it's even interesting to point out that he is wearing the Cross of Santiago, which is a cross of knighthood, but he did not paint that. The rumor is that somebody, possibly the king, added it after the artist's death. So that's if that seems a little out of place, that would be why. And another nice touch, there's so much, it's kind of a puzzle box of a painting, but in the background, we have one of the officials of the Queen, who also was in charge of the royal tapestry works, coming in the background, barely lit by the silhouette of the door. And here's something daring that Velasquez did. He painted the king and queen in a very hidden aspect of the painting in the background in a mirror with their faces blurred. And so it tells you something about the painting that maybe one way to understand it and understand what's going on is that even the king and queen are in some way subservient to the eye of the painter. And of course, when they come in the room and when they're reflected in the mirror, they get the attention of everyone who's standing there. All the eyes are indeed looking towards them, but it's Velasquez who is in control of the power of the picture plane. And I think that's how I want to close the lecture, is to say that I think the Baroque era is an era where artists, in working for the church, found a new expressive power and ultimately realized their own power.